Thinking about an outcome for a lesson at the lowest levels, I think is a bit different sometimes to higher levels, in that what we want to do is to think about how students can make the most of the limited language they have to take part in conversation. Now, I put conversation in quotation marks because what I'm thinking about is not an extended conversation. What I'm thinking is basic exchange using simple questions and answers. However, I am thinking that these could be genuine interactions where the students talk about themselves or get things that they want or need. One thing we could do at the lowest levels is actually teach question words sooner than a lot of course books allow. In order to use them, obviously we'll need to teach some basic answers. However, they don't need to be difficult. The students can answer with the names of people or places, so they don't need to learn any more English. Or we could teach them the chunk, I don't know. Or maybe we teach them basic numbers, so they just answer with a number. Or sometimes simple words. But the other way to interact genuinely is just to allow the students to reply in their own language. As teachers, we can either just accept that, or we could teach them the English, in our case, of that translation. I'm now going to show you an example of how this might work using the second lesson in Outcomes Beginner. Before we look at the material though, I should say that Outcomes Beginner is a bit different to pretty much any other published beginner course out there, in that it's very much driven by an outcome and by thinking about how we can enable conversations rather than being entirely driven by a grammar syllabus in a step-by-step way. The second thing I think it's important to say is that whatever course book you use, personally, I would recommend doing more work with the students. So taking some ideas that are in the course book, but presenting them a bit more upfront. And as we'll see as we go through the material, you encourage more repetition and more recall of what the students are learning, so that they're not simply reading off the page or just repeating those phrases that they can see. This is important in terms of the learning process. And the other side of it is it allows us to help the students with pronunciation and work on that side of their English, which is really important at the lowest levels. Okay, before we look at that lesson on questions, I just want to very quickly run through what the students have done in the previous lessons. So here we have the first unit of beginner, and what we have here is kind of pre-lesson where we are pre-teaching some language which the students may need in the unit. So we have numbers 1 to 12, and here we have a few words which will come up in the unit. Now, you could pre-teach these. They're matched to a picture so that they just see the picture. Number 1 is husband and wife, and you can see the picture here. Okay. And some of them are phrases like I don't know, that we purposefully teach as a phrase. We're not worried about the grammar at this point. We're just teaching it as a phrase. Very useful, especially to answer questions. So you can pre-teach it or just wait for it to come up in class at that particular moment in the unit, and then if you want to, you can use the pictures to help you explain the meaning of that word. So then we move on to the first lesson, which is kind of typical to begin with. We're just teaching each other to introduce ourselves. And then we move on to something slightly different to other books, perhaps, where I'm thinking about we want the students to be able to introduce each other or to remember other people's names and ask about them. So we teach them who is she, who are they. And this is the little practice where the students will talk about people in the class. They'll try and remember the names and tell each other and ask who is she, who is he. This then links to the kind of final, more real world task where the students are going to share photos that they have on their phone. If they don't have access to that, we do have photos at the back of the book which they can do the practice with, and essentially just ask each other who is that, who is she, who are they, etc. Now obviously the students can answer simply by saying the name, but we also want probably to say it's my brother, it's my sister, it's my mum. So we do teach that language previously, and that then leads into this final outcome. Okay, that's what they've done in the previous lesson. You get a good idea. Let's now move on to the lesson on questions. So here is the lesson on questions. Now, to get an idea of the kinds of questions we want them to answer: where are you from? How are you? Where is he from? How long is the class? There's a further practice here that they're working towards where they ask and answer these questions, and a final reasonably real world type task where they're doing a reading about invitations. But as we'll see, we could turn this into a task where the students invite each other to a party and ask questions about that. More of that in a moment. What I want to emphasize is the kinds of answers that we're looking for. Here you can see some examples, and just to notice how little extra language is actually required beyond what the students have encountered already. So we have the word good, hour, minutes, Saturday, China, but we're not really expecting this to be learnt. It's just we would probably focus on the names of the cities where the students don't need to learn another word, or we could just teach them the word for their country. Mother, daughter, these are recycled. Euros and dollars, but these are quite international words, so the students probably know them. We have a clock, but actually the students don't really need that either. They can just say the number. And then here we've got phone number. So this is the words phone number, maybe something new. So you can see it's very restricted in the extra language we are teaching students beyond the questions. Now let's look at how I would go through this lesson, what things I might cut if necessary because of lack of time, and as I mentioned in the introduction, which parts I would do up front with the students and working with them. So the first exercise that we have here is a review of what they did in the previous lesson. It's clear that for beginner students, they need lots of revision. I mean, all students do, but especially at the lowest levels. So I think it's a really important thing that we start off our lesson reviewing what's gone before. However, what I would say also though about this particular task, if you look at number 2, it says read the conversations and the students do it in pairs. I think what's important is that actually the students do some of this revision from memory. So they are trying to retrieve what they have done. So while I might ask students to read these in pairs to begin with, I would then get them up in the class, mingling and doing these conversations from memory. If I was teaching online, I would probably do that as an open pair. By that I mean everybody would be on the screen. Student A would start the conversation with student B. Then student B would start the conversation with student C with student D, etc. And they would practice in that way. We could put them into breakout rooms, but the problem is if there's only one person there, then they get very restricted practice. And what we want to do is to ask lots of different people and do it from memory in that way. Now, maybe you're in a class which is, 3 or 4 hours long, in which case perhaps we're continuing from the previous lesson. You wouldn't do this section. The next exercise is teaching a few numbers. As we saw previously, these come up as part of the answers to some of the questions that the students are going to practice and ask each other. Now, actually, you have 4 options here. The first option is just to follow the material as it is in the book. The second option is to teach the words up front as the teacher with the students in the class and basically do the follow-up exercise in a similar way. The third option is to ask the students to learn these words at home. They can do that because this exercise 4 is actually presenting the words and their meanings. It's not a test, it's actually teaching. So the students could use the audio script which they have with the book to learn these words at home. And then in class, what we might then do is to do this exercise 5 with the students to test how well they've learned them. And I'll come to that in a second. The fourth option, maybe particularly if you are short of time, is to skip this section and wait for the numbers to come up as they are needed when the students are asking and answering their questions. What you will find is that a lot of the questions can be answered with the numbers 1 to 12. And some other questions, the students may want numbers beyond 22. So in those circumstances, what I would do is basically tell the students the number they need using a translation or asking them to use a translator like Google Translate or a AI option, and basically just deal with the numbers as they come up. That is an option, and one which I do use sometimes when I'm short of time. I'm going to show you the process of presenting language up front with students when we come to the questions. So at this point, I would say do the exercise here or get the students to work at home, and then do this exercise as a test in class. What I would say is when I'm doing this particular exercise, I would play the audio, the students would write the numbers, they would compare in pairs, I would look to see how they were doing. I would then play the audio again, probably, especially if there were problems. And then I would get the students to tell me the answers that they had heard. Now, exercise 6 is to guess the next number in the sequence. What I would suggest is that you do this exercise with the whole class, either as you are going through the answers to exercise 5 or afterwards. So I do the whole process with the class so they understand what the task is. And then what I might do is ask the students to create their own sequence. You could tell them that in their own language, because I suppose it's a slightly complicated task. But if we've gone through this task together first, we've done 4 examples, we might assume that the students then have a good idea of what you want. The advantage of getting the students to think of a sequence of numbers is that, yes, they will obviously recycle what they've learnt already, but some students may know more numbers and they might write a sequence which includes those numbers. Then, again, probably I would do it as a whole class. I would get different students to read out their numbers. Then they can compare their answers in pairs. So it's just a way to give space to students to prove the language that they know, not just the language we have taught them. And I think this is an important principle that we can incorporate throughout our beginner teaching. So then we move on to the core aspect of the lesson, which is learning these question words. And again, we have the same kind of options. We could just follow the material as it is in the book, or we could do some of this teaching up front, knowing the content, but presenting it as the teacher to the students. And as we will see, then incorporating a lot more repetition and retrieval with the students. They will also get a little bit more extra exposure to the kinds of questions which they're going to ask and the kinds of replies they might want to give. So let's look now how I would present these words with the students. So what I'm going to do is show you how to present these words up front to the class. I'm going to start by assuming that the class is monolingual, and I am going to use translation to initially present the meanings before we practice everything else in English. If you're in a multilingual setting, you could use pictures instead of the words to prompt that we're going to see here. So I would start by simply writing on the board or telling the students the first question word in their own language. So I'd write cuánto on the board or say it out loud and then go listen. How much? How much? Get everybody to repeat. How much? And then I would ask each person in the class, or most of the people in the class, just to say how much individually. So I go, listen again, how much? Student A. They say how much. When they say how much, what I would do is reply as I might do in real life. So they go, how much? I say, £2. Next student, how much? $20. Next student, How much? £6. Next, I would put on the next word. I might ask the students, do you know? And see if they remember this word, because they have seen it already in the material. If not, and then I repeat, listen, where? Everybody, where? And the same principle, when each individual student repeats where, I would give a reply. Student A, where? London. Student B, where? Here. Student C, where? Over there. Student D, where? Madrid. Etc. And we give different typical short answers to demonstrate the meaning. I then put the third question up. What time? Drill, what time? Everybody repeat. Same process. What time? 2. What time? 6 o'clock. What time? 3:20. What time? And giving different answers each time. What I would also now start doing is maybe asking individual students, and ¿cuánto? See if they remember how much. Student D, ¿dónde? Where? And I would go backwards and forwards. If the student can't remember, I tell them to listen. I drill the word again for the whole class, get them to repeat it. We continue. How old? And go through this same process. And each time now I'm going backwards and forwards. So I might ask him, what was ¿qué hora? And what was ¿cuánto? And what was ¿dónde? In different order. So I wouldn't go through them as they appear here. I would be going backwards and forwards, asking different questions, building up that recall with the students. We then have ¿quién? Again, I might elicit this from students because they have seen it already and I hope learnt it already. So what we're putting in there is an easier one. They've had some which they are completely new. We're introducing something which they know already a bit later to ease the pain, if you like, make them feel that they remember something a bit more, that it's not too much for them. Again, I'm going backwards and forwards. And ¿dónde? And ¿cuántos años? And ¿cuánto? And asking the students to repeat the questions. And then finally we have ¿cuánto tiempo?, which is how long. And again, here I might kind of be giving answers 3 years, 20 minutes, etc. Once this process is over, I might ask the students, once this initial process is over, I might go through then and write the English on the board. But then probably what I would do is I would ask, what's the missing question? I ask one student for the last question that was we presented. And they go, how long, we hope. Then I ask another student, can you say the 2 questions which are missing? How long? Who? Then we go to another student. Can they remember the 3 questions? Then a 4th student, and a 5th student, and then the 6th student. Can they remember all the questions? So obviously here you might ask what you perceive as the weakest student to say just 1 question, whereas one which you perceive the strongest student to be to say all 6 questions. But everybody is rehearing these questions together. And that's basically how I would present the questions up front. You could have done a very similar process with the numbers, as I mentioned before. So we've taught them these question words. we can now do the little practice number 9, where we just check the students have understood what has been taught. I would do the first one with the whole class, elicit the question, and then get the students to do the rest on their own or in pairs. When they're finished, I ask for the answers, and as I'm going through, I might get the students to repeat the question, or sometimes I might give extra examples. So for example, where are you from? Where's my book? I'm not expecting the students to answer, although occasionally I might ask directly a student, for example, where are you from? So we're building in that question as we go along. The next exercise, in a way, gives the student some more examples of how to answer. So here we have 8 questions, in fact, because we're recycling one which we've learnt already, which is how are you? I would do the first exercise again with the class. So play the audio, ask them to suggest which one is the answer, and then tell them I will play the rest, and they have to choose the right answer that they hear. If I'm in a monolingual setting, I might tell them what to do in their mother tongue. Then when we're going through the answers, this time I would ask individual people questions. The other thing that I might do as I go through is I might ask, can you think of any other answers? And basically I just go through the exercise like that. The point here is that the students are getting exposure to the questions, how they sound, but also seeing the possibilities of how they can answer them. It's really just receptive understanding here. So now we move on to a little bit of grammar focus. One thing I often do is to write an example on the board, or the 2 examples in this case. So how are you? How much is it? And I would just highlight on the board the are you and is it. And then I would get the students to look at exercise 11, and I would tell them the instructions, are or is. Where blank you from? Are or is. Student might shout out the correct one, we hope. Are. If not, maybe they shout out is. You go, you. And then they know that this is not is. They will choose are. And you say, yes, are you? And maybe just drill it for everybody. So you get everybody to repeat, where are you from? I would then ask the students to do the rest of the examples individually and then comparing in pairs. Or sometimes I might ask them to do it together in pairs straight away. You could just go straight into exercise 11 without any introduction on the board, just by doing the first 1 or 2 examples with the students as a whole class. There is some suggestion, as I've mentioned before, that if you have a go at a problem before formal teaching, then this helps you to remember what you are trying to learn. The students have done it, they've compared in pairs, then we elicit the answers back from the students and write them on the board. Now, as I'm going through, personally, instead of waiting till the end of the task, where the students hear the words and repeat them fast and slow, I would be drilling these questions, and I would do them fast and slow. So listen, everybody, where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? Where are you from? And actually, I would probably try to get the students to say the faster version in the first instance. Not because I expect them to be able to do it, but to get a feel for how the question sounds in reasonably fast speech. It doesn't matter that you're not saying it exactly the same as me as a native speaker. We all say these things differently. That's not important. The important thing is the students are hearing the questions at different speeds. As the students drill and repeat, again, as we've done before, we could give a couple of different answers. And this time, I think we could also ask them the question and see if they can give a reply. And I would go through the 10 questions in that way. Alternatively, just do the exercise, and then as it says here, okay, everybody listen and check, and they would hear the answers themselves to check. And then we might go into 13 where we're practicing the questions. Here, I think what we could do is to introduce some element of recall, retrieval, as the authors of Make It Stick say. So I would get the students to basically see if they can remember all of these questions. I would give them 2, 3, 4 minutes just to try and remember them. Then the students can either try and write out all the questions together in pairs, or you could do it as a class activity where you get the students to write all the questions up on the board. And it's at that point also that you will be able to see again if students have misremembered and made any mistakes, you can correct them.